KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more. Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
Alt-weeklies are the free magazines you see at coffee shops or those racks on the sidewalk. They cover underground arts and culture and tackle news with a fresh voice. Alt-weeklies have won several Pulitzers and have played a big role in journalism and the country over the past 60 years or so.
Every major city had these, and they were all important. And they were so fun. They were irreverent, they were conversational, they had a point of view, but they also had a way of looking at the news of the day from a different angle because they knew they had to be different. And that's what alt-weeklies at their best did.
That's Scott Lewis, editor-in-chief of Voice of San Diego. Like so many writers, he got his start at an alt-weekly. So did I. So did Jonathan Gold, the legendary LA food writer, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, the influential critic of white supremacy. But alt-weeklies are disappearing fast. In 2009, the Association of Alternative News Media had 135 member publications. Less than a decade later, that number had shrunk to just 108. San Diego City Beat folded in 2019. Now, our last remaining alt-weekly, the San Diego Reader, is going out of print after 52 years. But one man, Matthew Licona, is determined to keep the Reader alive online for as long as possible.
I took a bigger pay cut than I'd like to talk about on camera to try to keep this going. It's very much what I love and what I will do if I possibly can.
One thing alt-weeklies are known for is what's called long-form literary journalism, longer stories and articles written with a certain flair or personality. Just like alt-weeklies themselves, it's kind of a dying art today. Matthew got hooked on long-form writing when he was a teenager.
I had a writing bug from way back. I had picked up a copy of Joseph Mitchell's Up in the Old Hotel, which was a collection of his profiles from the New Yorker magazine back in the 30s up through the 60s. And that was sort of my, this is what's possible with profile writing. The way you just get these people to talk and give you a whole world just by these long strands of conversation. And I thought that was a dream.
Matthew's been writing these kind of stories for the Reader since the 90s, when he was recruited right out of college. It's a dream job, and it's the only real job he's ever had. That person who recruited him was Jim Holman, who ran the Reader for the last 52 years. At its height, from the late 80s to the 2000s, they printed up to 160,000 copies a week, with many issues topping 200 pages. The Reader had an apartment in Coronado and flew in influential writers from across the country to stay there just to write cover stories. They were a force in San Diego's cultural scene. But Craigslist, COVID, and the explosion of a million other online media alternatives wore down the business. And now, at 78, Jim has run out of steam.
So finally, at the end of last year, I thought, this was a really tough year. And I went to my business manager, my sales manager, and I said, you want to buy the paper? I'll give it to you for free. And he said, no, I don't want it because I'm in debt myself.
That's when Matthew stepped in.
And I was telling it to Matt Licona, and there was a long silence. And I said, what? Are you interested? And he said, I so much want this to survive.
Matthew bought the paper from Jim for $1. When you buy a business for a single dollar, you typically take on its debt and liabilities. It's definitely not risk-free, but it can pay off. In the last 20 years, both TV Guide magazine and Reader's Digest UK sold for a single dollar and pound, respectively. And both were turned around and sold for a profit a few years later. So now it's Matthew's challenge to pull off that kind of improbable comeback and sustain an alt-weekly in what is increasingly a post-alt-weekly world. From KPBS Public Media, this is The Finest, a podcast about the people, art, and movements redefining culture in San Diego. I'm Julia Dixon Evans.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
I went with our producer Anthony to visit Matthew and Jim at the Reader's Golden Hill office just days before they had to finish moving out.
Hello.
Hey, Jim?
I'm Matt.
Oh, Matt. Nice to meet you.
I've aged 20 years in the past week, so I look like Jim.
Hi, I'm Anthony.
Hi.
Nice to meet you.
But you're seeing the demise. Because we take a lot of art.
Even though they'll keep publishing online, they've got to cut every expense they can. Printing and office space are the big ones. On the day we visited, Matthew called the place a mausoleum. In the back room, floor to ceiling, black cardboard filing cabinets are stuffed with something like 2,600 distinct issues of the Reader, which they desperately need to find a home for.
This is the Reader Archive Room. This is all 52 plus years of the Reader. Yeah, it's all here, and I've reached out to a bunch of the libraries, the academic libraries around town, and had a few nibbles, but high hopes that it will find a home because I think it's a pretty valuable resource.
We did some math, and those cabinets contain tens of millions of words documenting what's happened in San Diego over the past 5 decades.
So I'm looking at the issue February 16th, 1989. It is thick. It looks like a newspaper, not a magazine.
This is the 200-page era. 224 was our biggest issue ever. These are the fat years.
Can I take a look at that?
Please.
We had a lot of fun going through the filing cabinets, sampling issues from every decade.
Oh, here's an article. It's called What We Do Now is Disco. This illustration,
It's a really cool illustration.
it really is.
There's a story about how a North County Denny's allegedly serves up racial epithets along with its low-priced cuisine. Denny's employees were using racial slurs. Review of a theater performance. I mean, yeah, 220 pages a week is like... They're covering everything that's happening. Like, yeah, there's nothing falling through the cracks with this.
Even if you've never picked up a copy of the Reader, or regardless of what you thought of it, there's no denying that this archive really is an incredible time capsule of the city.
I wrote, when we did our 50th anniversary issue, and I wrote a little intro at the beginning of that saying, a lot of identity is memory. Memory is what makes anybody into a somebody. And this here is a memory of San Diego that was available to the whole city that asked and answered every week the question, what's it like in San Diego?
Jim Holman launched the first issue of the San Diego Reader in October of 1972.
The Reader was started as what they call an alternative paper, and it was independent in the sense that we didn't owe anybody anything. We didn't have any super large advertisers, so that gave us freedom of speech, complete freedom of expression. Yeah. San Diego was a town when we started that mainly had just the Union Tribune, San Diego Magazine, and some community papers. There was nothing quite like the Reader. So our niche was, I would say, largely cultural. We had a lot of music and movies, and for the first 5 years were very precarious. I was borrowing money from all kinds of people to try to make it work. finally, after 3 years, I think it was, we started to break even.
And after those touch-and-go first few years, they did much more than just break even. Jim made a counterintuitive decision that paid off in a huge way. Like a lot of alt-weeklies around the country, the Reader ran classified ads. You could list a used dresser or a spare room you were trying to rent. It was Craigslist before Craigslist. But instead of charging for those classifieds like everyone else at the time, Jim made them free. Both placing ads and picking up the paper itself cost San Diegans nothing. And that made the Reader huge. The value of regular advertisements went way up.
The great thing about the Reader was because we had free circulation and free classifieds, we creamed everybody. The Union Tribune, anybody else in town. Nobody could beat us. You can see the paper out there. We had hundreds of classified ads, thousands maybe of classified ads every single week given to us by people. We killed it, because the papers would fly off the counters every week. They'd be gone in 12 hours everywhere in town. And that was 160,000. So it was not just the numbers, but a very committed readership.
They did music, movie, and restaurant reviews and all kinds of local news stories. They also got tangled up in their fair share of local politics and controversy, but Jim's thing was those longer essay-like stories. That's what he championed in the Reader.
So when I say long form, we have run stories that have been 20,000 words.
Wow.
And there's a small market for that. The stories have to be very good and compelling, so you finish the story. But I use, at the same time, literary, because what I mean is good writing. And Bob Roth, the publisher of the Chicago Reader, where we got our idea from, used to say, the purpose of the Chicago Reader is good writing, pure and simple.
If you had to choose, what's your favorite story that you've ever done?
You know what my favorite story is? Was the Vietnamese kid who talked about his learning of English. He was a high school teacher at Coronado, and a white parent got him suspended over there because his son, didn't get a good grade or something. And we were outraged. And I knew he was a really good English teacher, so I asked him to come and write for us. And he wrote this amazing story about learning English from a Vietnamese point of view. And it's such a beautiful tour de force, yeah. And after he wrote that story, I got a call from a literary agent in New York who wanted more of his work. And I thought, yeah, he's very good.
Remember those free classifieds? The beginning of the end for the Reader and pretty much all the alt-weeklies came when those ads moved online.
We grew little by little by little, and there was never any trouble until Craigslist. But Craigslist was the symbol of online reality, because once people could go online, that killed the classified ads, and then everything else pretty much had the same problem, that you could get almost every other piece of information. And people weren't that discriminating. They could find, Rotten Tomatoes or something else.
Did you ever consider selling to a bigger company?
Oh, no way. No, I hate corporate America. I like small businesses.
The Reader's page count shrank from over 200 to under 100, and after COVID, to around 40 pages. Circulation dropped by about 80% too. But all along, even in its prime, the Reader had its critics, many who saw it as conservative. Scott Lewis of Voice of San Diego has a complicated relationship with the Reader, which he says is based on how they would call out his publication.
It had a different take in general, too. Alternative, in a way, was kind of conservative and also just very conspiratorial. And frankly, I had a lot of trouble with it, mostly because they would constantly attack me and what I was doing without ever, having the courage to call us or something. So it was a weird thing. And I think it spawned competitors. The City Beat started, 18 years ran, but the Reader was a big deal. People read it even if they said they didn't. And, I think it's still important. It has a wonderful music section and a lot of value.
On one hand, there's the extensive weekly music and arts coverage you don't always get with traditional news, but also there's those long stories. 20,000 words is long. That's almost a small book. Even 5,000 words in print would take you a good 20 minutes to read. These stories are rare today. At Voice of San Diego, Scott says they will go over 2,000 words for an exceptionally written story. But he acknowledges that a long alt-weekly piece can have a big impact, including one from the reader that still sticks with him.
They did a story a couple decades ago about the history of the frontier neighborhood in Point Loma in the sports arena area, where the sports arena is now, used to be a neighborhood. And I read that, and now with the discussion now about the future of the sports arena, it forced me to spend a few weeks doing my own work and doing an update in a way of that story. And I can honestly say that piece changed my entire perspective on San Diego, and I valued it tremendously. It's nice to have a forum for those things, and I think that's what's unfortunate is that 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 word piece in an alt-weekly in other cities could change the conversation for weeks about City Hall or about the culture.
I got my start in journalism writing for an alt-weekly, San Diego City Beat, with an editor who was willing to give me a shot. I wrote about coffee and hiking trails, and eventually visual art, dance, and music. Alt-weeklies have been a real haven for emerging journalists. Like me, our producer Anthony got his start at one. So did Scott Lewis.
One of the things that's special about alt-weeklies is that they would take a chance on anybody regardless of their experience. And they would give you a chance to publish about the most important things, to write about the most pressing things in a city, even as a young, inexperienced journalist or just somebody coming into journalists at an older age. There was so much opportunity that all they cared about in many ways was just getting a different perspective, and they would give chances to people who, like me, didn't necessarily deserve it. And I've carried that forward too, like hiring people who, maybe hadn't finished college or maybe had been in prison or in different situations because that you might get something special. You don't just go with the Columbia grad who, was at the top of their class the whole way through. Like there's always something special to be found if you give somebody a chance. And I'll remember that forever because they give me a chance. When I was at the City Weekly, the story I'm still most proud of from Salt Lake City is there was this incredible kidnapping. Elizabeth Smart was taken from her home at night. And every news truck in the world came to Salt Lake City that week. And I remember my editor saying, you should go do a story about that, but not the story about that. Like, you need to figure out some other way to do it. And I ended up doing a story about why her kidnapping got more attention than other kidnappings that had happened around the same time. And they taught me in particular from the beginning, like, you need to look at stories from a different angle. And that paid me forward in a way I never anticipated, a decade later or a few years later when I was trying to build Voice of San Diego, because I looked at it and look, I can't just do what these other news organizations are doing in town. I have to do something different. I was able to lean on that experience. And I think that's where an alt-weekly can really thrive is to put a different perspective, a different lens on what's happening in a community and force people to deal with that. And that's what they did at their best. And I think the reader had moments like that.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more, Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.
When he was a teenager, Matthew Licona started a literary magazine at St. Thomas Aquinas College, a tiny school near Ojai. And it caught Jim's attention at the Reader.
I got a call when I was up in college asking if I wanted to maybe try out being a writer for it. And They mailed me up a copy, and those were the very fat years, but there were these enormous long-form literary journalism stories.
Jim asked the then 21-year-old Matthew to come down to San Diego, stay at the Hotel Pension for 3 months, and write the kinds of stories he dreamed about.
So we got here, we got given a pile of books. We got On the Road, Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, Pump House Gang, White Album by Joan Didion, and then I did weekly meetings with Jim. We'd analyze various writing styles, and we'd talk about it. And he had me write a piece on the 20th anniversary of our Orchids and Onions Architecture Awards. And so I did that, and it was good enough. I'm still here 30 years later.
If you're thinking this level of opportunity and luxury is what normally happens to young journalists, it's not. And today, this is all just entirely unimaginable.
I was very fortunate. A real break.
The reader's not flying writers in to stay at hotels and write stories anymore. Matthew is just trying to keep this institution that gave him a chance in a career afloat.
I'll say there is a plan. There are really positive signs. Our traffic's actually pretty good. Our newsletter business is booming.
And you'll continue to have theater reviews.
Film reviews, restaurant reviews. Yeah, we do, I think, more coverage of local bands. We profile a different one every week, and I don't know if anybody else does that thorough a look. And then Gonzo Report is our attempt to, we don't want to do concert reviews, but we want to review what it's like to have been there. Again, what's it like in San Diego? So we'll document the scene, what's the merch, who are the fans, what happened during the show, as opposed to, this is how they sound.
For now, Matthew says the long-form stories, what he says make up the heart of the reader, are going on hiatus, but he hopes he can find a way to bring those back. In some ways, it feels like Matthew is fighting against gravity. This is really just the way the world works. Things change, old businesses die out and make room for new ones. Economists call it creative destruction. Netflix replaced Blockbuster, laptops replaced typewriters, and cars replaced horse-drawn carriages.
Ernie Grimm, who was my predecessor in the managing editor spot, would often call us, the very best carriage wheel makers in town in the auto age. So we've had a sense of our shrinking of that cultural footprint for some time.
But new things are never a one-to-one replacement. Sometimes we lose something real. Technically, a lot of things have replaced the alt-weekly. Craigslist took over the classifieds. Rotten Tomatoes replaced local film critics. Instagram became the new way to kill time while waiting for your coffee or laundry. So I asked Matthew, what do we lose without print edition alt-weeklies?
Well, the same thing you lose when you can't browse a bookstore. It's discovery. And we know that the online world is working very hard to build a bubble around you because it knows what you've eaten before, so it wants to keep feeding you that. And it does a really good job of that, and it's valuable in certain ways. But it's also very easy to get into an ideological silo, and it's easy to just miss a lot of the world when this or that bubble becomes yours. And so if you're not just happening by and snagging a copy of the Reader, and you go in looking for concert listings and you happen to find, we've got a great poetry column. And you find some World War I poet, and maybe it changes things for you. And so the opportunity of discovery is a real loss, I think, when you don't have something you can pick up that way.
I asked Scott Lewis the same question.
The value of an alt-weekly to a community is, I think, uncontestable. It's just wonderful. It can be a really important voice. All these countercultural folks from the 60s formed these alt-weeklies as this alternative voice to the objective institutional newspapers of a community. And they were so fun. They were irreverent, they were conversational, they had a point of view, but they also had a way of looking at the news of the day from a different angle because they knew they had to be different. And so I think its demise as a print product, as something that was available, especially the music stuff, I think it's a bummer to think that these major cities are going to now continue for, maybe forever without that staple of the coffee shops, that thing you could pick up to look at what's coming up, and just to have the print products are the original mobile, right? That's what you could carry with you, and now it's gone.
People who lived through the alt-weekly era understand what we're losing without them. But what about young people just coming into adulthood, those who never really had the chance to pick one up? We talked to Jesse Manioki, a student assistant who works with us at KPBS. We were interested in his take because he's deeply involved in the local music scene. He also works for KCR, SDSU's student-run college radio station. He told us he loves finding shows and bands to promote through physical mediums like flyers. So we basically described the idea of a printed alt-weekly to him. We were curious whether something like that would still feel useful or exciting to someone in his world.
I think for myself, I do like more organic approaches that come through, like physical copies, because online it just feels like another advertisement. But me stumbling upon, say, a show that's coming up feels more spontaneous. And for my work, yeah, it makes the job more exciting, because then you're finding organic things that you like, and then people recommend to you, and then you check it out, and then you're finding, rather than just copying, pasting something that someone paid for to put on a website. I think the discovery is a nice word to use, just because it feels more spontaneous and authentic. And I still feel like having physical paper, it's tangible. You can hold it, you feel the paper. There's a sensory attachment to it, but then I can trace those little magic threads. You can always look back at that as the starting point for when you discovered, say, a new band.
Do you feel like everything that you want to reach you on TikTok or on social media, do you feel like you're getting it?
Sometimes, but overall, no, just because I feel like I could be in a season or a time where I'm just liking the same thing. So then the algorithm is going to feed me, but it's not exactly what I need. It comes down to funding. Okay, if a label is backing you and all these TikToks, and you have an elaborate, you don't just have a ring light in your room, you have studio lights, you're going to be more attractive to just a scrolling person on TikTok than somebody who's, just strumming their guitar with a ring light. You feel a bit discouraged as an artist because you don't feel like either you don't have the time or the financial capabilities to fund the art, or if you're looking for something more authentic, you can get lost in the weeds of, say, industry or just high intensity content, and then you run into mediocre music.
The Reader was a physical token of San Diego culture, a source for non-algorithmic discovery. It'll still attempt to serve that in digital form for as long as possible, especially through its music coverage. And zines and other analog media like Bernal Book's monthly Mail Mag remain an undercurrent for discovering new things in print formats, the magic threads, as Jesse said. But looking beyond arts and culture coverage and beyond San Diego, without alt-weeklies, where have those longer essays gone? You can find some of it on Substack or The New Yorker and The Atlantic, but there is almost certainly less of that kind of thing today. For his very last big print story in The Reader, Matthew wrote an arts and culture article that worked on one level as a light read about what's happening in town, but on another as a metaphor for the reader's own impending metamorphosis.
And it was on the touring Broadway company of Some Like It Hot musical, coming through town and stopping and doing a little publicity event at the Hotel Del, where, of course, the exterior shots were Marilyn Monroe for the movie version. And during that, I sidled up to the mayor of Coronado, talking to somebody from the hotel, and he's asking, how much of the original building is just original? And he said, there's very little here that hasn't been worked on in one way or another. It's always about what's next. And then the whole play, of course, has a massive update, because by casting a non-binary character in a show that in the film version was about the humor involved in a dude putting on a dress and pretending to be a girl, They said in the interview, it's not a joke, it's not a trope, it's who I am and how I express myself. So I did that story and put it on the cover because we were going online. There's not much of what's original. Everything's been worked on. Everything's been always about what's next.
When we finished our interviews with Matthew and Jim, we spent an hour rifling through the old archives. These thousands of issues aren't just a history of the big events. They also capture the small human moments that make up life in San Diego.
This is a profile about a saxophonist, it looks like. Oh, there's a poem called Patriotics. I think the real thing is the classifieds, right?
Pets. A snake for sale.
$45. Python, quite friendly and loves to eat.
Oh, and then here's like the roommate listings. A single father, age 26, needs angelic, sensitive female to care for little girl, housekeep, and cook.
Good luck with that.
Responsible, straight, non-vegetarian. No rock, grass. It's like listed first before no drugs. Like, I don't want you addicted to drugs, but I definitely.
I need a non-vegetarian, angelic woman.
Lady with 2 children needs a ride to Denver around September 30th. Lady, don't do that. I'm gonna travel to the past and warn her.
There's a letter to someone's parents. Dear Mom and Dad, right off, I'll bet you're real surprised to hear from me. I think the last time we talked was 1971 when I called from Connecticut to ask for money.
For now, the reader's voluminous archive of little moments is still growing. Matthew is hanging on to his horse-drawn carriage wheels, his Blockbuster video store, just not in print form. And he'll do it as long as he possibly can.
This has been my professional life since I got out of college in 1995. I love it. I've done most areas on the editorial side of it. And I would hate to see it pass from just fade out, and that can happen pretty easily.
What are some scenarios that might make you decide to pull the plug? Like, is this something that you're just not letting yourself accidentally manifest by thinking about?
No, I have to think about it. There's a printer bill that's outstanding that you have to be able to pay all the weeks of because we've been running, a few weeks behind for years, and that's okay because you're always going another week. And we were always just about to turn the corner and become, a little more stable and start paying off some debts. And we ran out of room on that. But I have to think about what happens if we run out of room altogether. And so there's a hard number. And if we get down to that number, it's got to end, but it will not end unless we get there.
A special thanks to Matthew Lacona, Jim Holman, Scott Lewis, and Jesse Mugnocchi for their help with this episode. You can find pictures from our visit to the Reader Archives and links to some of the stories and sources we mentioned at our website at kpbs.org/thefinest. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with your friends. We're off next week, but in 2 weeks, we'll drop our first bonus episode where you can get a little behind-the-scenes insight with the Finest team about what's inspiring us and how we make the show.
I think the other day we were doing an interview and somebody mentioned that this piece was created by a piñata artist. Mm-hmm. Like, have you ever thought about the person behind it? To hear those stories, how do you become a piñata artist? I think that's one of the things that I'm excited to explore more of.
The Finest is a production of KPBS Public Media. I'm your host, Julia Dixon Evans. Our producer is Anthony Wallace, who also composed the score. Our audio engineer is Ben Redlosk, and our editor is Chrissy Wynn.
KPBS On Demand is supported by UC San Diego's Art Power, presenting cellist Joshua Roman, performing from his album Immunity, alongside music by J.S. Bach and more. Sunday, June 22nd at UC San Diego's Epstein Family Amphitheater. Reserve your tickets at artpower.ucsd.edu.